This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does without me lifting a finger, so I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Hello and welcome to The Shift, the podcast that aims to tell the no-holds-barred truth about being a woman post-40. Created and hosted by me, writer and broadcaster Sam Baker. My guest today is the award-winning author, screenwriter and poet Jenni Fagan. Jenni has written 4 novels, several poetry collections and been named Scottish Novelist of the Year. 18 months ago or so, Jenni and I met in a suitably spooky basement in Edinburgh's Old Town to talk about her incredible, harrowing memoir about growing up in care, Ootlin. An Ootlin, according to Jenni, is someone who creates their story without first seeking permission to do so. And you'll soon see why that couldn't be more apt. Then, life happened. The book's publication was delayed a bit, and the interview never ran. So scroll forward to a couple of weeks ago, and Ootlin was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. So I decided to raid the archives and have another listen. And what I heard was a moving conversation about building a life when society dumps you on the scrap heap before birth.
I've been examining stories all my life, and I had to transcend a story that I shouldn't have survived. And to have the imagination, the tenacity and the determination and the grit to dig your heels in and be like, I am just as entitled as anyone to joy. I am just as entitled as anyone to try and reach for my dreams, whatever they are. And I'm going to do that. No matter what anybody says, no matter what anybody does, they won't put me down.
As you'll hear, Jenni and I spoke really candidly about her childhood growing up in 29 different homes, how she preserved the shining girl inside when life was only interested in snuffing her out, how she became Jenni with an I, finding her cultural mothers, surfing her way through her 50s, and her obsession with property renovation. Content warning, there's some tough stuff in here, including reference to sexual abuse and suicidal ideation. When did you get fibromyalgia? How long?
I have had fibromyalgia now for about 25 years, probably. I've had it a long time, and it's got, for me, worse, probably because I don't do, I was always still having to be very busy and earn money. I'm a very driven person, and it's at opposition with my body all the time. So I've had it a long time. I've lived with it for a long time. And as I've got older and other things have kind of knocked on my body and my heart and my soul, the impact of the fibromyalgia's got worse. My bones hurt kind of top to toe a lot. And when it's bad, you kind of get up in the morning and you're hobbling about for a little while before you can, get yourself moving. And even after all this time, I don't always recognize a fibro crash, and they can be really brutal. I have loads of health issues, to be honest. They're all linked as well to my upbringing, is what I've been told.
Yeah.
I was doing legal proceedings in tandem with rewriting Ootlin, and I was assessed by court psychologists for hours and hours and hours and days and days and days and yada yada. Part of their conclusion was that the impact would be permanent on my health. There's no way around it. It will be, that's not going to go away. So you find your ways around it and you hope for the best, and you have to alter the way you live. I can't really go out and get drunk or do a lot of the things that I used to do because my body just won't take the recovery period well. So yeah, I live in a very simple way, actually. And that's really vital. And it's all stamina. Writing the novels takes a lot of stamina. And my life in general takes a lot of stamina. So it's trying to pace that out and learn bit by bit how to do it better every year, how to actually care for my physical health as well, and not just pour everything into the work and everything else.
Like writing, you say writing, I don't think anybody who doesn't write would understand how much stamina it does take. But Ootlin, this is the most incredible book. It feels really, really self-indulgent to say it's a really tough read because you fucking lived it. Mm-hmm. How was writing? How did you survive writing this, I suppose?
It was really, really, really hard to survive writing it. And survive is the right word, because when you're in the absolute thick of it, that is what you're dealing with. I hadn't planned on ever writing it again. I wrote it over 20 years ago, and it was the first thing I ever wrote, first long thing I ever wrote. I was 23 years old. I was living in the tiniest housing association flat on earth. It was so small, I had to hammer my bed down on the skirtings to fit it in the room, and it wasn't big enough for a washing machine. So I used to have...
Was that in Edinburgh?
It's in Edinburgh. It's actually the building that eventually became the inspiration for Luxembourg. It was a very creepy old tenement, very run down when I lived there. I was really struggling with the legacy of having grown up in the care system and being out in the normal world and experiencing what would now be called, CPTSD, not knowing what that was, having loads of panic attacks. I was quite agoraphobic at the time. I had been playing in bands and working in bars and doing all kinds of different things. But I come to a point where I just couldn't do any of it anymore. And I'd really struggled to ever look back. I'd really established when I was moving that you just keep moving. If you have to keep moving, you don't keep looking back. But the toxicity and the extremity of what I had been through was so overwhelming. And I was a young woman in the world with no family. I moved to Edinburgh at 16 years old I didn't know anybody. Moved into a wee bed-sitting homeless accommodation. I was there for 2.5 years. And then it got into this housing association flat, as I say, and I was just trying to work out what I had been bequeathed.
Yeah, how to be in the world.
Yeah, and I never picked my upbringing. None of us picked our upbringing. I never would have picked my upbringing, but it was mine to own, and I was going to have to make good on it, or it was going to destroy me. And I was really depressed at the time. I was feeling quite suicidal at points, and I'd sat down to write a suicide note, and I'd thought, this is really sad. I'm 23. Not many people are going to read this. I've had this huge life, far bigger than I would have ever chosen. And is that it? I'm just going to leave this little note and that's going to be it. And I thought, it's not enough, to have survived what I've survived, which took so much endurance, to conclude like this. And it was actually really weird. I went to bed and I had this, I used to have these very prophetic dreams. I still do sometimes. And I'd went to sleep and I'd had a dream that I was babysitting for these older women, and they were going to a ball, and they had a huge house, and we were in this big stately room, and I could hear all the children running around upstairs, thud, 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 thud. And the women were, dressed in all their fancy clothes, and I began to panic. And I said to them, I don't think I can do this. I can't look after the children. I don't think I can do this. And they came over and they said, they put the gramophone off and they came over and they opened an old tablet, the kinds that we used to write on originally.
Oh, yeah.
And they showed me the first one and they said, what this is? And I said, yeah. And it was a black girl and a white girl dancing together in ancient Egypt. And they said, yeah. And they showed me the second one and they said, do you know who this is? And I said, yeah. I said, that's a famous nun from history. And they said, it is. And they said, and do you know who it is? And I said, that's me. And they said, it is. And you know how to tell the children about the spirits. And I woke up saying out loud, the past is coming to visit me. The past is coming to visit. And I went to see my neighbour and I asked her if I could borrow her typewriter. And she had a little typewriter. And she said yes. And I got ink for the typewriter and a ton of paper and sat down on the floor. As I say, my flat was tiny, so I had a little tabletop on the floor.
Yeah.
And I put this typewriter on it. And for 3 weeks, all day and all night, I wrote my life story in chronological order as I remembered it.
Like you were possessed.
For the first time, yeah. And I say that there's a line in one of my poems in an early poetry collection that says, what is it? What I wanted was ecstasy, but demons speak through me. So I type for 20 hours a day, type until the walls turn char black, and all the leaves have ever turned to ash. That is how I write. 3 weeks later, I finished writing this book. Bearing in mind, I've left school at 15. I have no qualifications. I have nobody really that's been like, oh yeah, you can do this. There's no reason why I should have done this. And I've just done it anyway. And I always knew that I could write. I would have other people, people would notice, a teacher at school, or I would win a little writing competition, and I was always writing. But I always knew in my heart that I was a writer, and that what I was doing was working on the skill set I needed to become a great writer.
Did the teacher, Mrs. Kite, who you write about in the book, did that? I mean, I didn't write down what she said. But did what she said about believing that one day she'd see your name on the spine of a book, did that kind of comment from the occasional teacher, did that carry you through? Did that stay with you?
Any bit of encouragement or any positive statement when you're getting consistently negative statements about who you are as a child and worse is hugely important. Every act of kindness, every small thing, is remembered and is retained and is a contradiction to the overwhelmingly negative discrimination that you get as a kid in the care system. I've lived in children's homes, multiple children's homes, where there were campaigns in the community to close the children's home down, no children's home here. You're lowering the property value. They wouldn't talk to members of staff sometimes, couldn't drink in the local pubs. And that's just the tip of it. If I went into somebody's house as a kid and something had gone missing, they'd be like, oh, well, somebody from care has been in the house, or somebody from a children's home has been here. There's just this assumption of badness, that there's something wrong with you. And I'd always get asked as a kid, what did you do? It's like lots of children are in care for countless reasons, and very few of those because they are innately bad. Sometimes there's an illness in the family. Often there's an illness in the family. Sometimes you combine that with poverty and addiction, or combine that with, people being sent into prisons and not being able to, be supported to kind of rebuild their families. There are so many different reasons as to why children are in care. But the automatic assumption, there's something wrong with you, or you might do something wrong. It's like this superstitious, humans have always had to outsiders. There's the assumption that a stranger arrives, and what might they do? When you apply that to children, it's incredibly damaging, because kids need to be welcomed, and they need to be trusted, and they need to be loved, and they need to be held, and they need to be reassured that they're not some awful, monstrous creature, And, I'm not saying that there's children in the care system that aren't, don't grow up to, do terrible things. And there are in the private school system, and there are middle-class families, and there are the most
children who went to public school who do terrible things.
And we look at, the public school's an interesting one, because, I went on to do my PhD in essentially structuralism, so the structures of society and how they impact on the individual is my long-term obsession. It's there in all of my work. I am an individual who was raised by a structure, a very specific structure, raised by the state, raised by policy, raised by government, and raised by the impact of those things. I look at people in the private school systems, in particular the boarding school systems, and the very, very privileged subset of that. And they are some of the most generationally institutionalized people on the planet. They have been bred literally bred and reinforced within their schooling systems to think in a very, very specific way so that they can maintain and serve a very specific function in society.
Yeah.
They didn't choose that actually any more than I did. And some of them relish it, some of them go to town, some of them believe it. And you'd hope that some of them might question it.
I mean, you wrote this, you were 23, you wrote it in a kind of a fugue state almost. Put it in a box. What made you get it out again at 43-ish?
So I carried it around, and it's a little flight case I've got. One of my oldest friends had got me for my birthday one year, and I locked it up in the flight case. And it's had lots of old things in that flight case, that I'd had for a long time. And I never looked at it again, never read it again, didn't touch it. I have, in the last 10 years, lost my best friend. And I lost my ex and my other best friend. And, they all passed young. They all died young. And that really changes you in such a huge way. I've lost people all my life. People, areas, towns, whole swathes of things over and over and over. But those particular losses in the last decades really sort of weighed upon me. And my health was so bad at times that there were a few points where it was like, am I gonna still be here? And that changes you as well. And then I got COVID right at the start of the pandemic, and I was severely ill for about 18 days, and I was very delirious, and I've never been as unwell as that from something like that. And I felt like my history was being replayed to me. And as you do, when you think you're going to die, as a writer, you think, what work should I have left? That's one of the questions that you have. And started to talk to God, my God being the primordial matriarch who sent out that huge burst of energy 13.9 billion years ago, all of light, all of creation, all of destruction, all of the atoms and particles that make up everything we see and do, everything we are that's in us. And I said, if I could get more time to be here, to maybe see grandchildren one day, to live out a better part of my life, hopefully, what could I trade for it? And what is the book I should have done? And the answer was, Ootlin, you've had it sitting in a suitcase for 20 years, and it's more politically important than anything else you will ever do. And so I agreed that if I survived, I would try and better serve life. And I look at the generations behind us, and I just feel so much for them. They're constantly being given negative messages about the future, about the world, about what is possible, about everything. And I'm just like, whose story is this? Who's profiting from this story? Who's elevating themselves in this story? I find it absolutely abhorrent that that's what's being passed back. And I've been examining stories all my life. And I had to transcend a story that I shouldn't have survived. I was expected not to at countless points in my life. And to have the imagination, the tenacity and the determination and the grit to dig your heels in and be like, I am just as entitled as anyone to joy. I am just as entitled as anyone to try and reach for my dreams, whatever they are. And I'm going to do that. No matter what anybody says, no matter what anybody does, they won't put me down. I've been put down over and over and over. And so I got up, and then obviously I got a little bit better and I backtracked. I didn't want to do this at all. And then I thought, you really shouldn't backtrack on a deal you've made with a 13.9 billion year old. Yeah. Primordial matriarch is not a good idea. And so I am having to trust that for whatever reason, this was the right time to write this book again and to put it out into the world. As daunting and challenging as it has been for me personally.
I mean, it must have felt like surviving it all again.
100%. That is exactly what it feels like. And the issue is that when I was growing up, maybe you go through one thing that year that was terrible. Maybe you go through two things that year that were terrible. When you're rewriting the memoir, you are going through 16 years of trauma over and over and over. So I'm not dealing with one instance of abuse or one instance of homelessness or sleeping on the streets, when I was 12. Or I'm not dealing with any one trauma. I am dealing with 16 years of multiple traumas consecutively over and over and over. And it completely took me out. I remember one day sitting by the harbour in Edinburgh in my car and I couldn't move. I was just stuck in my car for about 5 hours, just unable to do anything. And I had to phone a couple of friends and be like, I actually physically can't move. I can't drive home. I can't do anything, So the impact was massive. And I think having done therapy for 30 years and having done lots of art and lots of other, that did help. But nobody's meant to look at the whole lot in one go over and over and over during a pandemic when you're very isolated. But that's how it worked and that's how it happened.
Like you say, you did 30 years of therapy. I mean, what, did you write this in 18 months?
Yeah. I rewrote it. I had to rewrite it in short bursts because I could only take being in there for so long. And then I would go back in. So I would go and come out, go and come out, go and come out. And obviously I have, I kept diaries from when I was a little kid. I burned about 20 years worth of diaries in London years ago. But I still have about maybe 30, 35 diaries, some writing actually from when I was in kids' homes, And I had my social work files, which I eventually got when the Freedom of Information Act came in. It took me,
when was that, about 2020?
Yeah. So it took me a long time, about 26 years, to finally get all my social work files. So I had them as a research resource, which was really useful. Lots of them are redacted in black. They're very difficult to read. They read much worse than most of the things that are in there. But in particular, for the first 5 years, lots of the things that I couldn't remember directly are all lifted completely out of the social work files. And they're shocking, really shocking. And shocking that people would write like that and not, even the fact that I think there's 27 different variations of my name and name spellings. Yeah. There's 3 different dates of birth that they rotate. And, they'll casually say things like, the child's being hit too severely pre-adoption or yada, yada. Yeah. There's so many different things that are, I look at now and I think, wow. But that was very useful. And of course, there are some things I do remember before that age. My life was so extreme that some of those early instances of abuse that I went through in particular caused me to have consistent nightmares all in my life, or triggers. There are sort of specific triggers I've had since as far back as I can remember. So certain things you don't forget. They're just too extreme. And then, the other parts are what I've put together from the files and from knowing things that I said, or, placements that I was in, things like that. And then after the age of 5, that's all kind of living memory. But again, I would go back to the files and I would go back and see what they said. And there's lots of things that I didn't put in there that were in the files because really I wanted to write my story. Mm-hmm. And
not the social worker's
story. And the way that they wrote about me is part of my story, but it's only for me to kind of observe academically in a way now, and also thank goodness those opinions that those people had made me incredibly unsafe over and over, and that never ended. And I left the care system still being hugely impacted by that. The dehumanizing element of discrimination means that humans are made unsafe by appearing to be less than human, less valuable, not worthy of care, suspicious. All of those things mean that A, how do you learn as a child to value and protect and look after yourself? And B, any predator of any kind is like, bingo, here's my demographic. Nobody's coming looking for them. They're not going to phone the police. And so discrimination isn't about just being unpleasant to other humans. Discrimination actively makes people unsafe, no matter what the form is. You're by perpetuating that, it allows another human to be unsafe.
This episode of The Shift is sponsored by Shopify. Is it just just me, or does it seem like everyone is either starting a side hustle or becoming their own boss? And you know what they're hearing a lot? It's the sound of another sale on Shopify, the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your own business. Shopify is the commerce platform revolutionizing millions of businesses, big and small, worldwide. Whether you're selling jeans or juice, books or blusher, Shopify simplifies selling online and in person. Covers all your sales channels from a shop-front-ready POS system to its all-in-one e-commerce platform. It even helps you sell across social media like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And it's full of industry-leading tools that give you complete control without having to learn new skills like design or coding. And thanks to award-winning help and with an extensive business course library, Shopify is ready to support your success every step of the way. What's lovely about Shopify is that no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify will be there to empower you with confidence and control to take your business to the next level. It's time to get serious about selling and get Shopify today. This is Possibility, powered by Shopify. Sign up for a £1 per month trial period at shopify.co.uk/shift, all lowercase. Go to shopify.co.uk/shift to take your business to the next level today. That's shopify.co.uk/shift. How did you learn to value yourself when you had been told, like from before birth, that you were the problem, bad, you were trouble, there's a moment you write about when standing on endless doorsteps. I mean, is it 29 places you lived?
Somewhere around that.
Somewhere
By the
around
time
that.
I was 16, yeah.
And that kind of standing on endless doorsteps where somebody's already been told a story about you, that it's their story, not your story, waiting to find out if you're going to be returned like something nobody wants.
Yeah.
How did you learn to value yourself?
I don't really know. I met some really great people in my childhood. I had some really lovely friends, and that helped. And occasionally there would be some adults in my life who would be really kind or really get me, and that really helped. I was lucky that I was quite often liked. Sometimes I really wasn't. Sometimes I'd meet somebody in a kid's home or somebody and maybe take an actor just liked me. But often I was quite lucky that I would have people that would like me. And that is a hugely strong counterpoint to people who are hating you or people who are, treating you very badly. And really, I think it was my ability to, have a really great built-in bullshit detector. I saw through people. I saw through social workers. I saw through policy. I was never convinced by it. I was never convinced that it came from a place of truth, actual truth. And when I was about 3, it says in the social work files, I cut up a bunch of photographs in my life care book, where they tell a story about your journey. And I just think, that was like a very early form of, I cut up their story because it wasn't mine. And I don't know if it's because what I had to survive was so extreme, so consistently extreme, that if my brain hadn't done that, I just wouldn't have stood a chance. I think that my brain had to evolve in a very specific and interesting way, just sustain, the level of trauma, the consistent moving, the very fractured identity, the name changes, all of those things meant that some part of my brain was having to do something very, very interesting. I think the thing that we forget when we think about, is it nature or is it nurture? Or, if somebody's been treated really badly, they have no chance, is that we arrive on earth as who we are. I could have been brought up in a lovely family and I still would have been me. Tried to explain to a journalist the other day, if you imagine removing everyone that you're related to, anybody that you've ever been related to by blood, and just take them out of your life altogether. Imagine you've never met them. You've not seen a photograph until, you're an adult. You don't know these people. You would still be you. You wouldn't have arrived a different human. You will be impacted by the way you're raised. Absolutely. And for a lot of people, it often is unsurvivable. The legacy of child abuse in particular was something that I did want to take the shame out of and say, you know, this is a societal issue. This isn't specific to children in care. You know, child abuse happens in middle class families, it happens in upper class families, it happens in our boarding schools, it happens in every religion, it happens in every country. This is a part of life. And we are a traumatized race living on a traumatized planet, and none of us are meant to talk about trauma. Much as, you know, there's that quote, all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others. Some people are a lot more traumatized than others, and it's because of racism or homophobia or, you know, poverty or, you know, whatever the thing is that they're having to deal with. And whenever you have one group that's placed as they're othered, they're placed down lower than the self, the big mainstream group, somebody is financially also gaining from that.
Yeah.
Capitalism is a huge part of the commodification of humans, the warehousing of humans, and the way that we have as a human race filed humans by their worth according to financial gain. And that's very fascinating.
Yeah.
For me to grow up and become old enough, you know, I'm 46 soon, which, you know, if you look at my history, makes me about 155. And
no one would have put money on you getting to 46, would they?
They didn't think I'd make it past 16. I remember the kids betting, and I remember walking up through the school one day when I was about 15, and a bunch of the boys were all making bets on something. And I was like, what are you betting on? And they looked a bit awkward. And one of them said, whether you'll make it to 16 or not. And I was like, all right, cheers.
Nice.
Cheers, guys.
So,
lovely.
I mean, at 16, you made an active decision, didn't you, at 16, that you were going to try to give yourself until 40 to try to make it in the straight world. Incredible thing for any 16-year-old to do. Can you remember what was going on?
Yeah, I can remember it very well. I was leaving the care system, having been in it for 16 years. You know, that was my whole life. I didn't know anything other than being, you know, from care and living in different families and dealing with social workers and being in social work offices. And, you know, when I was a teenager, I was a young offender. So you'd be up at the, you know, like the children's hearing, all those kinds of things over and over and over again. Not everybody I knew in the care system had made it out. You know, some of them had disappeared. There were kids I knew who had died, who had committed suicide. I don't talk about them in Ootlin because it's not my story to tell. I was very, very aware of the slim chance of me going out into the world completely on my own, knowing nobody, having come from what I've come from and being okay. And, you know, I'd had a children's hearing not long before I left care. I had to put forward a case that I would be allowed to leave the system. And I had been charged with, I can't remember, I'd been charged with something. And the head of the children's panel had said, you are a considerable danger both to yourself and to all of society. And in my opinion, you will be charged again. You won't be able to stop yourself. And when you do, we will place you in, you will be placed in young offenders and you will go into prison, which is where I think you belong. She didn't know me. She'd never met me. She didn't know me at all.
She just looked at the stories that were written down.
Yeah. Right. And she came with her own biases. She didn't even need to read the stories. Lots of them walk into the room wanting the little chavvy kid or wanting the little whatever it is they think is those people. You know, lots of these people will say, oh, you know, alcoholism's not in our families. Yes, it is. Child abuse isn't in our families. Yes, it is. You know, being a horrible bastard isn't in our families.
Yes,
it's clearly abundant in your families. Yeah. You're excelling at it. But I walked out and I just thought, I'm such a humane person, you know, I would always help some old lady if she wanted to cross the road. I could sit starving in your house and I wouldn't take money off your mantelpiece. You know, I had a really strong morality to me. You know, I was taking drugs and I was doing a lot of things that I shouldn't have been doing, but there's lots of great people who end up in walks of life where it's very hard to get by and be okay. You get dragged into the world that you're in and you try and be successful in that so that you're less victimized, so that you're attacked less. You know, I wasn't safe and I knew that in very brittle ways, and so I had to be as tough, if not tougher, as smart, if not smarter than all of the people around me. I had this feeling that I chose to stay in a life of crime. I would have wanted to be very good at if I was going to stay, whatever I do, I like to be good at it. You know, it was mostly drugs and things at that point. I knew to actually be good at it, to actually excel, to actually get to a point where you have proper power, I would have to relinquish my soul. And there was no two ways about it. As a young woman without family, without backup, I would have had to be nastier, meaner, crueler, tougher. And that means you have to go a long way. I was also aware that even after 16 years of living within the care system and going through so many extreme things, they hadn't killed my soul. They took everything else from me. They took my name, they took my dignity, they took my safety. But that light, that quality of light, they hadn't got that. I hadn't let them take that.
You talk a lot about shine in the book, and that really stayed with me. That sense that given everything you went through, you still managed to retain some of that within you, to take the small moments of praise or love that you were given and use them to top up that little shining girl inside you.
And I never wanted to be like the horrible people I met. You know, I saw the worst of humanity. I'd seen it all by the time I was 5 years old. You know, I'd lived in, I can't remember, nearly 15 places at that point. I'd had 4 legal name changes, first multiple last name changes. You know, I was not brought up in a normal way at all. And that teaches you something about humanity. It teaches you a lot about humanity. I studied families anthropologically. I would watch the way that people interacted and the way they justified who they were, who they would, present themselves as publicly, and who I would see of them privately. And so I always had the ability to question that on some even tiny level. However, as a child, you'll do anything to be liked. You'll do anything to be loved. So that cognitive ability to say, no, this is wrong. I would just think, I can deal with all the worst things in the world because that's my job. And maybe if I just be really quiet and really nice and get everything right, somebody will love me and somebody will go, no, actually, you're a good person. And when people ask, why adults stay in abusive relationships, that's trauma bonding. You want to humanize the other person. You want to, by saying, it's okay. It's okay. It doesn't matter. I can take all these bad things and I'm going to love you good. And then it finally will be okay. That is what trauma bonding is. I thought there was something deeply wrong with me. And that's what that kind of life teaches you. You are the problem. You are the monster. You are the bad person, not this, official person that the social worker's like. And, I've rarely met an abuser who thought they were an abuser. And they always blame the victim.
Yeah, always.
The victim is always the issue. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with your personality. Or maybe you've got mental health problems. Or maybe it's something else. Abusers have this extraordinary ability to believe that they're good people. And it bemuses me. I still think, wow, that's a trick. That's a hell of a trick. So whilst I had the ability to question it, I didn't necessarily have the ability to protect myself.
No.
And even as an adult, that has been a long journey. And I'd say I'm really only coming into it now. There's been a lot of difficulties in my adult life. I didn't leave care and move to Disneyland and live some kind of la-la lifestyle. The outcome of how I've been raised and learning how to respect my own boundaries and not have some other person, be like, whatever it was to justify who and what they were. That's been a 46-year journey. And one of the things that I do privately, to being somebody who's had multiple traumas, in their childhood and in their adult life, is I return it back to the person in my head. I think whatever, horrible, sometimes evil, sometimes just, badness, whatever it was, whatever they try and put in you. And that is what it is. It's a downloading of their sickness or their meanness or their cruelty or their thing. I return it back to them. It's not mine to carry. I don't need their poison. I don't need their, whatever the thing is that they should have been working out by themselves. It was nothing to do with me. And that was a huge thing when I was 16. I sat down and I thought, any child could have walked through the doors of any of those houses and they would have got the same treatment.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything to do with me. It was to do with them.
That's a huge thing, isn't it?
And it's the one thing that allows you to begin to think, it was just incredibly bad luck in a way for me. However, it was sustained and perpetuated by a system that commits that against countless people. I work with women in prison now, or, I work with lots of different communities behind the scenes. And so many of them are experiencing the warehousing of their lives, completely discounting the trauma that they've been through, completely discounting how important it is for them to rebuild relationships with their families, be in a prison that's close enough to be able to have access and visitation rights, to have a chance of getting a job when they come out, to building a skill set that can support them. I did a project years ago. I built a steel scold's bridle, but massive thing. I didn't know how to do it. I've always just done things that are very punky ethos. If you want to do it, just do it. And so I ordered big sheets of steel and I cut out this big mask shape, and these ears and the scold's bridle were used to convict women who were convicted of the crime of scolding. And it would have a big metal spear that would go down in your tongue, and a big contraption that went around your head, a harness, and you'd be paraded through the market to show people what happens when a woman's convicted of the crime of scolding, which was one down from cursing. And I engraved it with words sent to me by women in prison all over the UK and in America and on death row. And one of them said, I'm sure one of them said, the system is built for warehousing. They're warehousing humans. We should have people before profit and planet before policy.
When did you become Jenni with an I, Fagan?
I took the Jenni with an I back. I put the I in myself, probably when I was about 8 or 9. And before that, I had 2 adoptions, neither of which worked out. And I had obviously my birth name, and there was 2 different last names used in my birth name. Yeah, I don't really talk about it because, legally I don't want to pinpoint any place for other people. But it's very weird. I mean, my first name was changed the first time when I was 3.5. And so I'd already completely lived under another name as long as I could remember. The only thing I arrived with was my name. You wouldn't get a dog and call it Billy and then 3 years later call it Mike, because the dog would be looking at you going, what's your problem?
I was going to say that, and I thought, I don't want to offend you, but, our cat's called Sausage because that's what he was called when we got him from the rescue.
Exactly. Adoption, it's got to be a difficult journey for adoptive parents and adoptive children. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Thank God for every instance of that. But you really have to accept that you are taking a child into your home that has a completely different genetic lineage, and they're entitled to that as part of who they are, and that will also include their name. If you can't even accept their name, what else can you not accept about them? And quite often people will be like, they wanted a little blonde kid who was just like them, or they wanted a very thin ballerina, or they wanted a ... They wanted to cure their own history. They have also got the very specific discriminations of society ingrained in them towards the child they're taking into their home sometimes.
Have you ever met or tried to meet or even seen your biological family?
I don't talk about it, but I am on my own in the world. So I'm a parent, and I don't talk about that either. But no, I've lived 46 years without family. I met one person a few times, and it was a difficult experience. So no, I very rarely meet other people who do their whole lifetime without knowing their family. But I do on occasion, and it's very rare, and always quite striking because it is very much a different way of living. I'm proud of it. I'm proud that I've found my own way, and, that I made my way to music, and I made my way to punk, and then grunge and art and counterculture and lots of the other communities where lots of other people who don't belong go to be a part of something that makes sense to them and that will accept them for who they are. And that's what I'm offering back in a way in Ootlin. I've been influenced, and my life has been made infinitely better by those people, lots of whom I will never meet. I've just sang their songs for years, or, I read their books over and over, their films. I'm offering that back, the people who are now coming behind me. I'm at that specific point where I talk early in Ootlin about taking cultural mothers and cultural fathers, cultural brothers, cultural sisters. I'm old enough now that this is the point where I send back my lighthouse, and, hopefully that meets with people who will need it. That's the purpose of this book more than anything else. I think if our literature can't actually serve a useful need when things are so hard, what's the point? For me, and I love light, fluffy, throwaway, but that ability to sort of connect in that very real way in a world that's trying to disconnect everybody in a very, very persistent way, people want that real connection.
This episode of The Shift is sponsored by our friends at Wild Nutrition, who are offering you 50% off for 3 months. As women, let's face it, we've got a lot on our plates. So good nutrition is key. And this is where quality food-grown supplements can really make a difference. Our bodies are wired to absorb nutrients from food. So I was surprised to find that 95% of the supplement market is synthetically derived. Wild Nutrition believes you deserve better. No synthetic fillers or binders, just food-grown ingredients that are as close to their original food form as possible, scientifically shown to be better absorbed by your body. Founded by one of the UK's leading nutritional therapists, Henrietta Norton, and with an all-women nutritional therapist team, they empower every woman with the nutrients and knowledge to thrive at every stage of her life. Alongside their food-grown women's health range, covering hormonal support, fertility, pregnancy, perimenopause, and postmenopause, they also carry favourites like magnesium and KSM-66 ashwagandha. Their nutritional consultations are free, and I found mine so helpful. It was a total game changer. If only I'd discovered them sooner. I've been taking their energy support, and I can already feel that old lethargy lifting. Wild Nutrition are so confident that you'll see a difference. They're offering the Shift listeners 50% off for 3 months when you visit wildnutrition.com/shift. That's wildnutrition.com/shift. And if you don't feel the benefits within 30 days, they'll give you your money back. T's and C's apply. On the subject of cultural mothers, that really, really resonated with me in the book, that looking, and finding voices that speak to you, that you learn from, and the difference that they made in your life. Who can you pinpoint any particular people who made an impact?
Yeah, no, there was lots of them, and I would find them at different times. So when I was 15, I joined my first punk band. I was working in Coburn Street. I was working in ground control in Coburn Street.
Is that shop's not there? Is it?
It's
I
not
walk
there
past
now,
the others are there still.
But they used to do the piercings and the pewter and the kind of gothic dresses and the t-shirts and stuff. Anyway, there was an advert in the window to join a punk band, and I hadn't really listened to punk. I was really into like 60s and 70s music, but I hadn't really listened to punk. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go and try an audition for this band and see what happens. And they gave me a bunch of, a tape cassette with a bunch of, musicians to listen to, nearly all female. And they were just amazing, and they were, polystyrene and X-ray specs, just absolutely loved her. She was so cool and so brilliant. She ran away from home at a really, young age and started off in London on her own, young working class girl. Got into punk, Lydia Lunch, Patti Smith, lots of other kind of counterculture figures began to kind of be a part of my life. And I found out that Iggy Pop had grown up in a caravan park, and I felt less ashamed of, having a chunk of my life in a caravan park. I was still in a kids' home when I auditioned for the band, and I sort of apologized to them. They were like, where do you live? And I was like, well, I live in a kids' home, and I'm sorry, like I will move out soon. And they thought it was really cool. I was just like, I didn't get it. I didn't get there was a community where actually my background could be seen as something of value to me as an artist. And so that was massive. And then there were huge moments like discovering Nina Simone. I listened to Nina Simone over and over and over for years. I loved Mazzy Star. She was very kind of gentle counterpoint to that, but it was very, meditative. The one song, I adore Tracy Chapman. I think she's just like the best kind of, she's just an amazing folk singer. She's like Bob Dylan, but she's Tracy Chapman. And Fast Car, just that one single song. I remember hearing it when I was really young and just over and over and over. There was a Bob Dylan song, She Belongs to Me. She's got everything she needs. She's an artist. She don't look back. She's nobody's child. The law can't touch her at all. I remember hearing that when I was really high in a party when I was 14 and just thinking it was written for me, discovering Basquiat, discovering the Surrealists. There's so many different pivotal moments of seeing people committing their lives to doing something brilliant and unique to them. And the punk bands were really great for me, and the grunge bands, because I could go and scream and I could go and really have a voice, a big voice, and hold that stage. I'd be terrified going to buy a pint of milk, My anxiety was dreadful, had severe anxiety, suffered from panic attacks and CPTSD, but put me on a stage and I could totally hold the space for an hour, and I didn't get arrested. Nothing bad happened. And there was community, and I met my ex through that. I met some really good people through it. And I have all the time for all young people finding their people in culture.
It's such a big moment, isn't it? When that point in your life when you find your people.
Yeah, exactly. And in literature, in books, it was always happening. I had a library card for Central Library in Edinburgh. And so even when I was in homeless accommodation, I'd be like toddling up the hill and getting my 10 books and reading them and then going back and getting more. And, without libraries, I wouldn't have done this. Without libraries, there's no way I would have done this. I couldn't afford to buy books. So they're vital, absolutely vital resource. And when they say they're closing down the libraries, I really think, wow, that's a sinister way to tell society that they are not allowed to think. They're not allowed to have an imagination. They're not allowed to have an individual thought. That's creepy.
It's intentionally shutting a door on particularly kids with no other way out, but on all children.
And the door's been getting closed for, a while. It's, in the 70s and 80s, for whatever reason, lots of different reasons. There was lots of, working class kids and, lots of, hip hop came along. And there's lots of other things that were just making this amazing presence in the world. And it seems like in the last 10 years, so many of the industries are just held hostage by a vast majority of people with privilege. Those doors have been very deliberately closed. And so for the odd person who, has a counterpoint to that, and I am an odd person, like I'm absolutely counterculture, I'm absolutely literary, I'm an artist, I'm also a doctor of philosophy. I can respond to the structures and the academics and the policy makers in their own language. And often I'm more educated than
I bet, yeah.
a lot of them. It's a very unusual position to hold. And part of me thinking having visibility, allowing my history to be a part of my visibility is, offering my own example of that. I feel like things are so difficult ideologically and financially and in so many ways for people. Anybody who can get through, or anybody who is through, who can respond, doesn't have the liberty to not do it right now. I'd rather have stayed home, lived in a wee cottage, done knitting and never looked at my history at all. That would have been peachy. I have something unique to offer, and I care about what's coming after me. I care about, people surviving the unsurvivable, or making their own path, or just feeling like their existence is as valid as any other person on earth.
I'm going to ask you the questions I always ask at the end now.
Yeah,
which feels incredibly shallow after the conversation we've just had. But let's just lower the tone. What is your emotional age?
My emotional age, I think, is about 155.
I'm not surprised. I'm not going to ask you why, because I know, because I've read the book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beyond lived.
Yeah. I'm hag through and through.
Hag and proud.
Yes. It's been the best thing that's happened to me, is getting to the hag years.
I was just thinking, how do you feel about aging?
I have found that it's been better and better. It's been a bumpy ride. My 20s were bumpy. My 30s were bumpy. The start of my 40s were bumpy. The whole thing's been bumpy. But the work you put in pays off. All the decades of, doing work on yourself, challenging yourself, creatively, emotionally, it pays off eventually. And I feel good about it. I always had an idea that the last decades of my life would be the best ones. I always knew it was going to be a struggle for a long time, and I fully intended that to have a payoff, and I'm still working towards it. But one of the parts of that payoff is to prioritize joy. I want to get a little house by the sea one day and go surfing every morning and have like a beach garden. At the moment, that's not the case. I work a lot all the time, but it's nice to have a dream.
Can you really see yourself ever stopping working?
No, I would work the afternoons and the evenings. But if I could surf in the morning, that would be a big step up. I can't surf. I've never surfed, but I'd love to.
Never too late to learn.
It's never too late. I met this amazing woman in San Francisco. I was in a little biker cafe in San Francisco. And I was traveling around the States, meeting loads of amazing writers, loads of counterculture people who were just brilliant. And she said she was in her 60s. And she said she started surfing in her 50s. And she works 4 months of the year driving her Uber constantly. And then for 6 months, she just goes surfing. And then she starts another 4 month cycle. She does her Uber and then she does another 6 months surfing. And I was just like, you have
Nailed it.
And she didn't start until her 50s. And I just thought, there's time for me yet. And with the fibro, I'm not sure how much but I'll push it. I'll see what I can. Even if I just end up bodyboarding, even if I just end up sitting on a surfboard, I'd be happy.
Yeah. Give us a book recommendation. So it can be something deeply significant or it can just be something good that you've read recently.
I liked Derek Owusu's That Reminds Me. It's one of many, many, many books that I've read recently, but I think he's got a really, really unique voice, really cool way of doing things. He's a poet who's a novelist. I always think our best novelists are poets, our best musicians, our best bakers are poets, so I'd recommend that.
Brilliant. What advice would you give younger women?
You have so much more value and so much more power than most people are ever going to let on. Don't ever be convinced otherwise.
Yeah, no one is ever going to tell you.
You have to take that for yourself, and don't worry about being liked. The people that are meant to like you will like you, and the people that use that to exploit you are not people you want to like you.
Right. If only you knew that when you were young.
Yeah, and you need to keep saying, we need to say it now. I would have took on board more of these things if I'd been hearing them,
Yeah.
But we just didn't have those conversations, even in the 90s. It wasn't done, I look at some of the language around kids' awareness of things now, and I'm just like, wow, that's hopeful.
It's a big shift, isn't it?
Yeah.
Who's an older woman who inspires you?
Patti Smith. I think
I want to be her when I grow up.
I love that Patti Smith had a rock and roll death, actually dying. She just disappeared for decades. Lived with her husband, Fred from MC5, and had their kids and did her thing. And then she decided to come back to work in her 60s and just blew it away. I saw her perform and just, had tears. She was just brilliant. She just, she's a flying shaman. I saw Odetta perform when she was in her 80s. She had to kind of stand against the stool and it was just her. And then she opened her voice and she was just like huge. I think Tracy Emin's amazing. She's an extraordinary artist, and it's so nice to see her go through, in a way, the metamorphosis that she's been going through in recent years for her work. I adored Frida Kahlo, Leonora Carrington. I could go on and on and on and on. I
would let you, but I think you'd probably get bored of talking to me. What's your superpower?
My superpower is renovating houses.
I wanted to ask you all about that, but we don't have time.
I have the ability to make a space beautiful with very little resources sometimes, but just I have the eye for a space. And I lived in lots of kind of ugly places. Lots of the kids' homes, they're not nice looking bedrooms or buildings, and I slept rough. I lived in lots of very poor areas, lots of very run down council estates, etc. So making something functional, I'm very good at it, and I really love doing it. And I think if we were one of the great ways to really improve life within, one small way to really improve life within our estates and our council house, and is make sure there's accommodation for people, make sure there's accommodation for people from care, for people any vulnerable demographic, and make it nice. It wouldn't be hard to make sure windows facing the south, to make sure you've got a little tiny patch of outdoor space if you can have it. Paint the buildings nice colours. Don't make it all grey and pebble dash, and you can hear your neighbours, and as if every part of your existence must be devalued from the outside in. Quality of life. Just having a cup of tea in your back step. Everybody should be entitled to do it. And our homelessness is really bad. And it's like, just address it.
It was so interesting reading the book and having followed you for a long time on social media. Your thing with properties and renovating them, doing them up, that really started to make a lot of sense as I was reading the book, that kind of constantly making a home.
Yeah. And I'm, all of my fiction novels are based on specific buildings or specific locations. Those structures where when I moved into a new home when I was a kid, the first thing you'd see was the building. the first thing you had the relationship with was the building. And, I was sleeping rough on and off between 12 and 16. And, I've slept in roundabouts, I've slept, kind of all over the place. And that absolute lack of a structure, metaphorically and in actual reality, it really does call to something in you. Home is important. Whatever makes home a home, everybody should have one safe place they can shut the door.
Last one. How many fucks do you give?
None. None, not even a little one.
See, I couldn't have taken a bet on whether you were going to say absolutely loads or none at all.
You have to get to a point where you don't, because everybody is used to imprison you. Do you know what I mean? Like women, we care so, we don't always care so much. Sometimes we're absolute monsters, but do you know what I mean? It's like, it's a manipulation to have to be courteous and always have, it's so exploitable, sick of all of that. It's never ended in my life in one way or another. And my tolerance is now like 0.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy The Shift and would like to show your appreciation, why not buy me a coffee? Go to www.buymeacoffee.com/The Shift with Sam Baker. You can hear a new episode of The Shift every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you hear, please do rate, review, follow, tell your friends, because it really does help other people find us. And if you'd like to know more about my own experience of shifting, my book, The Shift, How I Lost and Found Myself After 40, and you can too, is out now in paperback.
Unexplored catacombs buried beneath the city. A crumbling castle perched on a mountain peak. A top-secret government bunker. A cursed mansion cloaked in legend. I'm Sasha Auerbach. Join me and Tom Ward every Wednesday and Sunday as we reveal the mysteries and histories of abandoned places around the world and ask, where did everyone go? Brought to you by Like a Shot, makers of Forbidden History. Search for Where Did Everyone Go on your favorite podcast platform.